Welcome to this Ludgate Lecture. The Ludgate Lectures began this year, named after the offices of Bright Blue at Ludgate Circus. The purpose is to invite prominent thinkers and decision makers to talk about the great issues of the day. Bright Blue, for those who do not know us, is an independent think tank and pressure group for liberal conservatism, so I'm very pleased to chair it. My background is in journalism, so I'm especially pleased to welcome today our speaker, John Micklethwait, who is the Editor-in-Chief of Bloomberg, where he oversees editorial comment across all Bloomberg platforms. He's also a distinguished author, and his most recent book, co-authored with Adrian Woolridge, was The Wake-Up Call: Why the Pandemic Has Exposed the Weaknesses of the West and How to Fix It. We might ask if and how Joe Biden is fixing it, and some thoughts on the forthcoming G7. What is the role of government and who is best at it? So I'm going to ask some questions and then open to the floor. We'll be live tweeting the event using the hashtag #FutureOfJournalism. So thank you very much indeed, John. And if I could start by asking you actually how Bloomberg's doing and how the economic model is working.
Well, thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Bright Blue. I think in general, actually, at our end of journalism, it's working very well. We don't talk publicly about the number of terminal subscribers, but they have gone up, which is the people who are paying the money to get the terminal. On the consumer side, we have 300,000 people now, more than that, paying for the consumer product. And under virtually every measure, the journalism is doing well. And I think part of that is to do with people now being much more willing to pay for good content. And again, it's very nice of you to focus on Bloomberg, but you look across most of the quality media at the moment, and there has been this huge surge. And to some extent, there has been a sort of retreat back to quality. And that's one part of it. The second part is really that during COVID, I mean, we launched a whole series of new products, things like Bloomberg Green. We have a social media, and now a streaming service called Bloomberg QuickTake that's grown enormously quickly. We discovered we could do all these things even when we were back home. And as you can see, I'm now in my office, even though it looks a bit like a casino behind me. We are gradually coming back to the office, and we think that will help. So from most of those points of view, it's actually been quite a strong time for us. I know that isn't true of every bit of journalism, but I think that is pretty true of most of the kind of bigger brands at the kind of quality end of the market.
It's an interesting point, because some of the great sort of news online movement, places like BuzzFeed, have then had to retreat again. And so what's the secret of getting people to pay for your content?
I think the secret, I think as a whole, and I've said this repeatedly for nearly 15, 20 years, going back to my time at The Economist, I think our industry committed suicide by stupidly embracing giving away its content for free on the internet, rather than keeping to the model of getting people to pay. And that handed over power enormously to the obvious people in the tech industry and so on. And they did very well out of this, and the industry did not do well. But what's happened, I think, over the past 10, 15 years, or certainly the past 10 years, The Economist was a kind of leader in this. But the Financial Times also began to do this. The Times did it here. You look now at the number of subscribers, things like the New York Times have, the Wall Street Journal. You look at how quickly it's only taken us a couple of years to get to 300,000. The possibility, the market for people who need good, accurate information and want to know about the world is an incredibly large one. And so I think at all those ends, you have people coming in, and now most of the kind of competition, new sets of competition, are coming from people like The Information, Axios, Substack. These are all people who, again, are going for models where you get people to pay. Now, that doesn't help you particularly if you're running a small regional paper, or it doesn't help you if you're certainly quite big regional papers in America. But at the top end, at the moment, being really straightforward about it, the market is growing, competition is incredibly fierce. And I think at this precise moment, there's more of a war for talent than I've seen for quite a long time.
So there is a career for journalists now, in the way that one doubted for a while.
There is. I think there is, and I think actually in general, that's what happened. COVID was an event where people, yes, there was a lot of rubbish out there, But that in many ways only increased the value of what was useful. And if you look at things, I mean, look at the stuff we've done at Bloomberg, and I'm using us as an example. Other people have done other things. If you look at something like the vaccine tracker at Bloomberg, where we tracked exactly how many vaccines, we still do, how many vaccines have been taken around the world, or we have a virus tracker, that kind of information, you need resources to do. And people, came in, clicked on it, and immediately wanted to sort of take it up. We now have a pret-a-manger tracker in terms of measuring the number of people in pret-a-manger as a way of measuring how people are going back to work. This is, information data like that is incredibly useful. And people like those sort of things, and they're prepared to pay for it because it's real and it's accurate and it's substantial. And that's not true of a lot of stuff you get in the more sort of flim-flam bits of journalism.
So data journalism really has been the great strength.
Exactly, you're right. Data journalism has been one big strength, but a lot of the other stuff has actually just simply been reporting. We have 2,700 journalists right the way around the world. It's probably bigger than if you took most of the bits of what people used to, the broad streets of Fleet Street, and put them together. It'd probably be somewhere around there. But that means we have 30 people in India. You can do a lot of on the ground reporting, even in these sort of very harrowing times there, and get stuff back to people. And there is a big market for that. People want to know what is happening around the world, and I think that's quite a big thing. I think that you could make the argument a couple of years ago that really, what happened miles away didn't have that much effect on you. Well, I think really the lesson of life recently is, yes, if what's happened in Wuhan in China has an effect on you, just in the same way as 20 years ago a lunatic in a cave in Afghanistan had an effect on the world. You need organizations that can tell you about that world and tell you about it with some degree of accuracy and certainty. And actually, I think if you look at COVID, I think you could argue that journalistic institutions were much quicker than governments to realize how important it was. Again, to be nice to my old employer, I think The Economist had on its cover, COVID goes global, roughly, I think, a month before the British government eventually went into lockdown. So, journalism was out there, the quality end of journalism was out there telling people what happened. Bloomberg last January, we were reporting on this virus because it was important. And it's not just, you talk about data journalism is really important. So is technology. We have technologies, we have computers here scouring the world, going through every version of social media and so on, looking for things that could be newsworthy. And then we have people who have to run those and check whether it's true. But you can repeatedly, I think, find examples, both, we obviously look at commercial things, we look at companies' earnings and things like that. But we also look for slightly more distressing things like explosions and whatever. And you can pick those up and you can monitor them and you can put out headlines about them much, much quicker. So you have this wider world of social media, but in the middle of it, in our end of the business, you have a lot of technology trying to decipher it and sorting out the fact from the fiction. And the reason why is because if we say something, we know that people may bet very large amounts of money on that. And so we have to get it right.
It's a wonderfully optimistic picture. When I think of when I was leaving newspapers thinking they were pretty much finished, and going to Facebook, I remember, and saying, we just need some money. Could we have some? And they said, look, we can help you with your profile. And we no, it's not the profile, it's the money that I need. And now, we're seeing, I guess, those technology companies under some pressure, to perhaps declare themselves still as journalists or, take some responsibility. I mean, is there a rebalancing going on? Can you, or am I being too sophisticated?
I mean, one, to make one comment I've always made personally rather than speaking on behalf of Bloomberg, but you look at the tech giants, I see absolutely no reason. They are making editorial decisions time and time again. You saw that with even the stuff about Donald Trump. They are deciding who gets onto things. And yes, at the moment, they are not subject to the same editorial rules that you or I am, or you in your old jobs were and I am now. And that is something that's wrong. And in the end, we need to fix. So that's me personally. me as an analyst, I think we are in one of those moments. You look back through history, there are certain times when, regardless of the rights or wrongs of particular industries, you feel a sense that the world, the consumer world, it's kind of moving against them. And I think that's incredibly true about you look at what's happening to the big technology companies in Europe, you look at what's happening to them in America, and there is a kind of sea change underway where people are asking themselves, whether they want these people to have this degree of dominant power, and they are taking steps against them, some of which I don't entirely approve of, but they are moving in that direction. And if you ask what I don't approve of, I think in Europe there's quite a lot of anti-Americanism behind it. But all the same, there's no doubt that just as an analyst of the world out there, that big tech generally, the world is moving against them in most parts of the world, and that's even before you take in places like China. So yes, they've had a very good run at this, but you can see even in the way that some publishers are beginning to get much more money out of them, and so on and so on and so on. Just as an analyst, I think the world is heading in that direction. And once the sort of world changes like that, we saw that 100 years ago with American oil companies. You can look at British coal companies in the 40s. You can look at the whole variety of different times where an industry has lost its kind of franchise from society to be able to operate in the way it has done up to that point. And I think big tech is moving in that direction. And so, in some ways that could help us in Bloomberg, in other ways it may not. But that's I think just a fact. And I think the people who are running those companies are now much more aware of that than they were a couple of years ago.
It's interesting looking at some of the measures that Nick Clegg is taking for stop trying to give regulation to other people, because I guess that's the worry, that might you lose the ideal of free speech in all this. Yeah.
And again, I think people like Nick Clegg, who again may not be universally popular, but and I don't agree with everything he's doing, but I think what is interesting is that there you have an intelligent man cleverly trying to come up with answers of it from within Facebook. And I think, you probably might disagree with one or two things I've said, but the basic idea that this is an industry that eventually is going to have different rules, I think is something that he's on side with, and most people are. And there's an element of the industry saying to government, give us new rules, and then sometimes not liking them. And then sometimes rather lazily, the government trying to say, well, why did you set the rules? Mm. At the moment, we still have an unbalanced playing field. And we still have, I think, a sense that the public as a whole is not happy with the degree of dominance out there.
And that sense of sort of who sets the rules. So you mentioned Donald Trump and his inability to get back onto Twitter and Facebook, and that's done through an oversight board. But clearly, that's a filter. So immediately, are you sort of creating things in your own image? Again.
In the end, that's surely the decision. Two things. Me personally, and for obvious reasons, I have a complicated relationship with Donald Trump. There is something very strange about 4 or 5 rich technologists deciding whether the then President of the United States is allowed into a large part of the public sphere or not. And I don't, that does not make sense to me. And I think there are other people like Angela Merkel and so on who have the same thing. And I think to some extent, those technologists didn't want to have that choice. Yeah. They ended up with it in part because government has not. I would like a situation where government puts down at least some rules, which then establish, who should set those spheres. But it's a very tough thing to push someone out of the public sphere. And again, in Trump's particular case, you can point to all the different ways in which he can still reach his audience, and you could talk to all the malign ways in which he spread falsehood via his accounts, but he was still the President of the United States, and I think saying is correct.
And the sense that he can't return because I think the criteria is still real world harm. That at the time you thought that you might have a sort of a breakdown of law and order. Do you think that's still the case, or?
I think on that, again, that's one of the examples of how the rules are kind of set in a rather a strange way, I think, at least to me. Again, my starting point is, how do we cover these things? How do we look at them? The basic concept of whether you're allowing people free debate and so on, and that really is down for politicians, I think, free societies to set that, rather than to hand that particularly over to companies. The bit where I am, I think, the bit where I'm worried on in that particular debate is the ability for people to continue having free speech and being able to do things. I think the level to which tech companies have been given power to, or exceptions from rules I have to follow, I'm not incredibly happy with that. But on the whole, more draconian regulation, is the bigger problem in more societies around the world. If you look around the world at the moment, and again, we have 2,700 journalists, 120 countries. You've got China, obviously, you've got Turkey, you've got Russia, you've got many places around the world which really are clamping down on what we can and cannot do. And that, I think, is part of a kind of bigger change. And so I think some of the kind of hand-wringing about what exactly individual politicians in the West are or aren't doing is, I wring my hands too, but there's no doubt that if you look at where press freedom is really under attack, it's more in those sort of countries.
And what can Bloomberg do about that? Actually, that was something Nick Clegg, I think, made the point that, if you think Facebook's a problem, look at China, we're actually the best hope against that. What is the way of ensuring kind of free speech?
Is to report, to say, if you go back to my example of COVID at the beginning, you go back to climate change, you go back to any of these big things that are happening around the world, the more information you give people, the more you empower them. And that, I think, is, it sounds rather trite, but I think that is really important. And it's something that, where possible, you try and do everywhere. You do as a global organization, you're sometimes frustrated about what you can distribute in different places because you have to follow local laws. In terms of reporting to the wider global audience, you can continue to do that. And I think most reporting in the end gets through. And so there are lots of things in the world where I'm quite pessimistic at the moment. But in terms, I think, of the ability of people generally to get information out, and the way in which people have begun to trust information that matters, there I'm becoming more optimistic. And I certainly wasn't that optimistic 4 or 5 years ago, because I think 4 or 5 years ago there was just an onrush of kind of rubbish on social media, and there wasn't as much sign of people being able to pay for things. And I don't think there had been something along the lines of COVID where it had been so obvious that facts matter, and where it was really, really important.
And to be able to disseminate them. So there's been a lot of talk, obviously, about sort of fake news, but also the ability to, manipulate news and facts and so on. How do you manage to counter that?
Well, the answer is everyone tries very hard, and like everybody else, we occasionally get things wrong. There are people who will go to amazing lengths to try and hoodwink news organizations, and actually particularly really in some of the areas where we are leaders, like sort of markets and things like that. If you can get one piece of fake news through and then try and make money out of it, you can make a lot of money. So there is, we have a lot of checks virtually the whole time they work. It's a mixture between having technology that searches through, checks whether you've got the right internet address, checks whether the person is reliable, and so on. In general, you remember earlier I talked about the way that we have computers monitoring things around the world. If you want an example, from not that long ago, there was a shooting on the New York subway. What was interesting then was how, I was in New York at the time, was how rapidly using computer power we were able to establish quite quickly there had been a shooting. through social media, scouring social media, through looking for keywords, through looking at the local police reports and things like that. So purely using computers, how quickly we were able to do that. But then shortly afterwards, there was a picture, I think, posted on Twitter of one of the alleged perpetrators in a sort of pool of blood, a rather grisly one. And what was interesting there was that whereas as a news organization, we could very rapidly establish that something had happened and somebody had been shot, the veracity of that photograph, we had to be much more kind of gingerly about, because it's so easy to produce a fake photograph. So what was interesting watching the people who were trying to verify it, it came down to things like, was it that kind of floor in the subway station? Were the pixels in the right order? And you've seen, the examples of what people can do with images. So at this precise moment, yes, I'm as an organization, we are extremely wary of any attempt to try and feed us fake information, because as I said, people who then act on it can obviously get very angry if you've given them the wrong information. But the bit where I think as news organizations we are particularly vulnerable, and here I'm talking about the industry rather than us just particularly, is I think sort of fake video and things like that is where it's getting very tricky, because you see something and you think, oh, that's true, but the level of ingenuity of the fakes is getting much higher.
And I guess still that line between information and entertainment and people's sort of tolerance of one going into another, whether it's a generational thing. I do remember actually at the BBC, it was James Harding, who's head of news at the time, saying, better be right than first. And it was a slightly sort of bracing thing to hear coming from newspapers. But how do you think the BBC is doing at the moment? And I mean, there's going to be a new head of Ofcom. There was a sense of whether the government was going to put more pressure on the BBC. How does it look to you at the moment?
The BBC's, I mean, we compete against and use the BBC around the world. It's an amazing institution by most people. So you work there, you know all the strengths and weaknesses. It does, the obvious point, it faces a problem on the revenue side, which is hardly a great secret. And at some time, I suspect it'll have to make some choices. But I think in general, the bit where I really monitor it is the kind of quality of the journalism. That's still amazingly high. I know it gets harried by people in different quarters, but especially on the kind of level where we are. In many places, if you look at the big global organizations that are really trying to cover the whole world, it's one of the few alongside us who are doing it. There are a lot of regional news organizations at the moment where you could find some people who are very strong in Europe, others who are very strong in the United States, a few who are quite strong in Asia. You don't have many who are strong across the whole panoply of that, and that's where the BBC is.
So the figures for the World Service are astonishing now, actually. So you do see where the growth is.
I think we can learn. I think in many ways you could learn from that a bit as other news organisations. Whatever, and again, its strengths and weaknesses, and we can all point to mistakes the BBC has made, even some around your time. But big organisations make mistakes. But in general, the quality. The brand you build up over time of just getting things right repeatedly is an extremely useful thing, and people, some bits, people will look for ways to criticize it, and there was definitely a time when you certainly had people, particularly in the Conservative Party and the right in Britain, who were fed up with the BBC. I think what was noticeable is I think the BBC on the whole covered COVID extremely well. So I think that there was a sort of return to doing things right there. And I wish Tim Davie every success.
And thank you. Just to remind people that you can ask questions via Slido. And I have a first one coming in, which is, can there ever be a balanced approach on the internet between protecting freedom of speech and addressing dangerous misinformation, such as around vaccines?
I think you have to find a balance. I mean, in a strange way, it does go back a little bit to when I was, you might argue, whining about the tech companies. In the end, you've been an editor several times. I know editors take responsibility. You have to make decisions along that line. And sometimes you're going to get it wrong, and sometimes you're going to get it right. And it's you, on the one hand, you do want to have a balance. You want to get people from all sides saying things. On the other, if you have people saying things about vaccines that are manifestly untrue, it's also in your interests to point that out. And I think it's kind of indicative of the sort of the way in which news goes at the moment on vaccines, is that certainly to begin with, there was a lot of misinformation about vaccines. And I think there was a lot of genuine concern from many people about the efficacy and so on, and stirred up by various people who should have known better. But I think now that people have got them, now that the information has got more broadly out, there is a correcting process that goes on. And I'm always, it's a useless piece of history, I'm always reminded in this is that, we are in the middle of yet another technological wave breaking through media, and it's been going on for maybe the past 15, 20 years. I think I became editor of The Economist in 2006, just after Twitter, the same week that Twitter came into being. That has been continuing. But you look back through the history of what we do, Sarah and I do, and there have been the succession of kind of crazes. You go back to the early 19th century, you had the invention of the steam press. Suddenly you could distribute paper, vast amounts more. Printing presses could push out much, much more paper than they could ever do before. And you had a complete profusion of rubbish, really, of pamphlets about everything, with libels so grotesque that even the worst bits of social media today would compete with it. And the biggest selling newspaper at the time was, I think, called the New York Sun, set up by a man called Benjamin Day. And that sold, I think, 1 million copies, which at the time unheard of, by far the most successful newspaper. And it used to specialize in headlines like saying there were half bat, half humans living on the moon, to which when people said that's wrong, he would say, well, prove it. But what happened is, you look at the 19th century, is that the good stuff eventually pushed out the bad for two reasons. The first was that people who wanted to pay, just like I've been arguing this, they started to want to pay for good information. And so you had organizations like The Times, The Economist, all these sort of things being founded to answer that. And the second point was really from advertisers. In the end, if you were an advertiser, and that was when advertising was really only just beginning, you didn't really want to advertise your soap beside the kind of idiotic story about the half man, half human, half bat living on the moon. You wanted to put it beside things that were slightly more fact-based. And so that engendered the kind of media, the old media as we now call it. But I think it strikes me we're in the middle of another of those sort of waves. Sorry, it's a slightly indirect answer to the question.
It's very interesting about the market value of it. Does your sort of Voltairean, though purist journalist heart wish that we could just make the arguments about vaccines rather than just say we're not even going to discuss it?
Yes, I think people are allowed. I think if somebody wants to argue against vaccines, there are for instance, people. An interesting one to me was when the results came back, which queried a few small things to do with, I think it was young people on Astra. Well, I could argue from a public safety point of view, were more lives saved or harmed by that, by giving the amount of credence that people gave to those rumours. And I think from a purely public safety point of view, you might well make the argument that more lives were harmed by people being reticent about taking the vaccine. On the other hand, I think from a media point of view, I think suppressing that would have been the wrong thing to do. And I think we are there on the whole to try and give as many people the Voltairean approach, to try and give as many people giving people the right to say things, even if we disagree with them very, very, very brutally when they say it. We should still agree with their right to say them.
I suppose that is a point about that freedoms are lost through best intentions, and do you see any result from this sort of pandemic era that will affect what we're prepared to challenge? And I
think not yet. I mean, you look at And again, look back through history. Go back to the Great Plague in London, and in the Great Plague in London, if you had any plague in your house, you were only allowed out with a white stick. Well, and people handed over by the time fairly draconian powers to the government, just as we did. We let the government tell us to stay in home, not go to work, do a whole variety of different things, not hug, that we might normally want to do. But the government has gradually been given, releasing those powers, just as it did 500 years ago. And, effectively a plague is a bit like a war. You do surrender powers to government, and then government normally hands it back. And I think what's reasonably encouraging about most of the powers that have been handed over in the West, at least, is that they've been on a kind of very obviously temporary basis. We said, yes, we do want apps that tell you where we are and so on. And there's been a sort of reasonable attempt to try and push them. And you'll find people at both ends who disagree. You'll find people, certainly in parts of America, who will complain vociferously about, being told to wear masks at different times and stuff like that. And on the other hand, you'll get public health people saying, well, if by not doing that, they're helping kill other people. So the two combat, but in general, I think Western society has made a reasonable stab at it. The places where you worry are quite a lot of countries that end in stan, and other countries, China would be one, but places where people have claimed powers, India even has had some of these, where people have claimed extraordinary powers, and then there is a suspicion they may not want to give them all up. So I think the answer on that is, so far it's looked fairly reasonable, but wait and see.
That slightly brings me then to your book about what we learned from the pandemic, and who did well and who did badly, and this sense of competence that you looked at those governments, particularly in the Southeast Asia and so on, who just were much better at it than we were. Or do you feel more forgiving towards the UK now, or where do we stand in terms of how badly we've treated, I guess, us and America with the two places you named?
Thank heaven for Kate Bingham. I suppose in general, I just checked actually the numbers just before coming on this. A big part of the wake-up call was to point out that the numbers of deaths per million in Britain and America were completely out of order with what has happened in the new economies of Asia, and that what was interesting to us is that firstly, we thought government mattered. And secondly, we pointed out that the governments who did well are exactly the same ones who are doing much better than us on education and all these other things, where we've been falling behind all the other functions of government. I think what's definitely true is that vaccines have been a huge success for Britain and America. I think it's probably been more a private sector success than a public sector success, would be the first point I make. The second point I would make, and I say this as a lifelong and obsessive fan of Leicester, is that this is a bit like a football match where you're 5-0 down. There was a football match the other day where Leicester were 4-0 down, and then somehow managed to score 2 goals in the last 10 minutes, which was great and made me feel slightly better at it, but we still lost 4-0. You look at the numbers, I just checked, they're up above me now. America has 1,780 deaths for every million people, and Britain is very sadly at just below 2,000 deaths for every million people. You go to Japan and the number is 95. You go to China and the number is 3, not 300, 3. So by most measures, yes, we've got a few, thanks to vaccines, we've got a few goals near the end of match, but by any normal standard, our governments have not done well at this. And you go back to the Evening Standard, you compare London against New York and Seoul, they're all about the same size of city. And London, I think, has lost about 15,000 people. New York is up around 30, 40,000. And Seoul is in the low hundreds. And these are huge, sprawling cities. Seoul is a place which has got, some of the world's biggest nightclubs. It's got crowded streets, made parasite. You cannot run into lots of sort of Asian stereotypes about being more orderly. Home of K-pop. and yet they just ran this thing much better than we did. And so I think if we shouldn't let the wonderfulness of Kate Bingham and the success of British science, I think, generally obscure the fact that overall, we did not do well. And I think looking at the charts, I think we are still worse than any other main place except possibly Brazil now. Germany, for what it's worth, is around 1,000 deaths per million. And you can argue about who measures things in this way or not. And I think certainly the Chinese are undercounting their number. But even if they're out by a factor of 10, they're still hundreds of times better than we are. That is a terrible thing for the West, I think, to look at and try and learn from.
And an interesting thing that will come up at G7 is this now sort of pledge to try and vaccinate the world. And of course, America does have these huge supplies. I mean, the turnaround on America from those bad figures to having this, extraordinary supplies apart from anything else, and being able to. I mean, it's interesting about America because they don't have the NHS, which is what we thought worked for us logistically, but and yet logistically they ended up being pretty good, didn't they? And now have this excess supply. So once we start vaccinating the world, who are going to be the winners in that, do you think?
I think in terms, well, just on America, I've been reading about Britain. I think on America, you can say some of the same things, is that America has done extremely well at distributing vaccinate, and they've tended to use, again, the private sector very well on that. I think in terms of America's sort of failure with COVID, I think there is a danger that people will look back on it and blame it on Donald Trump. Donald Trump did not invent a health system that was so skewed towards looking after the old and the rich, and so bad at looking after the poor. And you look at the sort of savagery of COVID in various parts of America, and I think that will still haunt people long after it's gone. On the G7 and vaccines, yes, it is a great and wonderful thing that we have these vaccines, and it is absolutely in interests of everybody. And I think this is the bit to really get across. And again, I've been reading about Britain and America, but you look at the useless squabbling in the European Commission over vaccines. The sooner, the more people who get vaccinated around the world, the better for all of us. And you can see it in terms of these new variants and things like that. But the more this disease is around, the more it's able to change shape and move. And so it's not just a question of us sort of morally wanting to stop people needlessly dying. I think it's also a question of self-interest. We need to do this. And I think the G7, it would be a useful place to re-establish it. I would also add, I think it's quite a useful zone for Joe Biden. Here is something where America is trying, I think, at the moment to look more competent, and vaccines certainly help that. And secondly, it is trying, I think, to sort of reunite the democracies of the world. And the main and obvious way in which you can do that is through trade. But Biden is not particularly great on that, not least because of the problems he has with unions back at home. So if he can't do it through trade, vaccines is one area where he could try much harder.
It's interesting about the democracies, and I think that's the sort of opening theme, isn't it, of G7, of shared values, of open societies. But how good a shape are they, if those democracies, compared, as you say, to perhaps more competent but less liberal models elsewhere? What's the best model of government now in the world?
I think the lesson of our book was that it was very straightforward, is that basically the democracies did better. The kind of the false positive was you look, and you can really look at two things now. At the time, it was only one. You could look at the world's most powerful autocracy in China and compare it with America. And as I said, the numbers are just startlingly different. China claims a figure of 3 deaths per million. Well, maybe they're exaggerating. Maybe it's really 30. But by any measure, as I said, we probably have more journalists in China than any other news organization. I don't think anyone thinks the Chinese are lying that much. America, as I said, is around 1,700. So the Chinese have been, 50 times, 60, 70 times better at protecting their people than their main rival. And now you have the example of India, where things are getting out of control. the world's biggest democracy. So you have that kind of counterpoint. But look more broadly, and the most successful countries are all democracies. It tends to be places like Australia, New Zealand, Taiwan, Singapore, notwithstanding what's just happened there, the Scandinavian countries, and so on and so on. It's the democracies on the whole who've done really quite well at this. And you look at the dictatorships, you wouldn't want to have COVID in Russia or any country that ends in stan. You certainly wouldn't want to have it in Iran or North Korea. In general, democracies can take some pride in it, but I think in general, it's more a West versus Asia. You've had this change in government. You look at places like Singapore, they came up with a way of having smaller, better government. They came up with a system where you have schools where bad teachers get sacked and good teachers get paid a lot more than ours do. And for that matter, good civil servants. The head of the Singaporean civil service gets paid $2.5 million. Nobody in America would get anywhere close to that in public service, but a lot of people do in private service. But at the same time, Singapore's prepared to sack bad teachers in a way that America is not. And what's happened, I think, is you've had an Asian model of government beginning to develop. I mentioned Korea earlier. See what Taiwan's done. You can see other countries in that region beginning to borrow some of these things, including China. And if you look at something like the schools league tables, those are all the countries now at the top. They spend less money on education than us, and they get better results. And so, maybe we should be copying them in the same. It's very similar. Somebody pointed this out to us. It's very, very similar to what happened in cars. You and I are both obviously very young, but we can probably remember the 1970s. If you had a British car, it would probably break down which we did have at least every couple of months. American cars were exactly the same. Japanese cars, they were smaller, better, and they worked. But nowadays, every other car company around the world copies what the Japanese did originally. Then it's introduced the same manufacturing techniques, all those sort of things. We've had 20 years at least of these Asian countries being better at things to do with infrastructure, education, increasingly health, and we haven't copied them. So maybe we should start copying them. We're still driving around in the equivalent of an old Rover.
But it might be an electric one, mightn't it? And are there ways where we can now show, that sort of innovation? That's another thing for G7 and COP, and I guess for UK this year. Is there in the environment also, a green market that someone's going to win?
As I said at Bloomberg, we set up Bloomberg Green, and that's been a huge success. And you look at the web, and again, in this particular case, look at the work that Mike Bloomberg's done, probably the man who's given more money to green causes than anybody else. There is a lot to do. I think from a British point of view, it's quite interesting that you could argue, and we don't want to go back into the rights and wrongs of Brexit, but if nothing else, it has set up Britain with the possibility of becoming a kind of exemplar in some of these things, and the sort of targets we've set ourselves in terms of greenery. Those are the sort of things that we can pursue. We are facing a much colder market in terms of environment, in terms of the economy. I think pretty much everyone can agree on that, regardless of the rights and wrongs of, as I said, of Brexit and people taking back control, quote unquote. But it's a much harsher world out there, but it also offers opportunities. And if Britain can move to the front of these things, and I think it's where the COP meeting is a useful kind of generator. We had a very interesting story yesterday on Bloomberg, which pointed out the big banks, for the first time, for the beginning of this year, they are now lending more money to green projects rather than to oil companies, which they've always done despite all the pledges they've said up to the beginning of this year. And that is interesting, I think, is that there is a huge sort of swathe towards green industries. Britain has quite a lot of leadership in some of these areas, and we could build on it. So I think the green thing is actually particularly pertinent to a country that has sort of moved into a new sphere, for better or worse, again. And it gives us an opportunity, I think. One of the advantages of not being in Europe, the ability to set your own rules in some of these things and try and push it. Britain is a big enough market that if it sets its own rules, some companies are going to have to follow.
It's also interesting that the role of business or the sort of corporate sector on leading the way in some ethical areas, which, you might get a sort of hollow laugh from certainly some people on the left, but actually Jess Phillips, I was talking to the other day, said, for instance, on some of the women's issues, private organisations are sort of way ahead on things like the HR practices on domestic violence and so on. So in a way, that business may be more sort of fleet-footed, but that could show the way. Do you think that this could be a good time for?
I think there's a lot of truth in that. I interviewed Mark Carney a couple of weeks ago for Bloomberg, and he pointed out on greenery, he thinks that the private sector is now kind of jumped ahead of the public sector. And the stuff about banks, I think on questions of equality, where I should say another thing we managed to launch in a self-advertising way over the course of the past year or so is Bloomberg Equality, which is an attempt to try and round up numbers about that. And there are amazing numbers. We had a story 2 days ago pointing out, interestingly, that whereas white British families have increased their net worth in property over the past decade, the increase for Black British families has been zero. Interestingly, the people who test were British Indian, which is by itself another story to look at. But I think anything to do with the way that the private sector is now much, much more targeted, post Harvey Weinstein, but post also George Floyd, at looking at these things. We see it particularly in the kind of growth of ESG money. We set up Bloomberg Equality for lots of different reasons. But one was that simply that is where so much money and investment is now being dictated by concerns like that. When I say being dictated, I mean is in the good sense of that word. People are now, you look at shareholders meetings, you look at corporate resolutions, you look even you look at corporate boards, the number of women who are being somehow certainly presented more obviously. There is so many different ways in which private companies, whatever their many other weaknesses, are doing it. And underneath it, yes, it's partly to do with regulation, but it really, in the end, it's to do with market. It's to do with the market. It's to do with if you are on the wrong side of that barometer, when it means you will not do well with consumers. But it's also actually to do with talent. In the end, it goes back to what you and I were talking about, journalists at the beginning. One of many, many reasons to set up Bloomberg Equality is it's also a way of attracting talent. It's a way of showing that you care about these things, and that matters when you're out there fighting to try and get hold of the best people. And I think that's true of us. It's certainly true of a lot of other companies as well. You can see it pretty much across the spectrum. So again, what we do with Bloomberg Equality is we try and hold them to account and say, what are your numbers on this? And there is certainly a degree of kind of on the environmental side, what people call greenwashing. That's whatever the equality equivalent of that going on at the moment. That that again is a phase. People will rush forward with initiatives that don't really mean things, but then you can start really investigating the numbers. And if there's one sort of thing we've learned at Bloomberg, is that idea you sort of follow the money. If you follow the money, you can usually, sometimes it can head in the wrong direction. It's your job to report about it. But also, what's happening on some of these areas is you've got companies spending real money trying to change things. Other cases, you have companies claiming they're spending real money, they're not. And that's our job to monitor them. But it is happening, I think, by any stretch of the imagination, the kind of media landscape you and I joined, obviously, not that long ago. Very dramatically. And I think that's true of many, many private sector companies.
It's very a cheering conversation, this, about a sort of race to the top. You always think follow the money is going to mean sort of race to the bottom, and that's not the case. That's sort of, There
are lots of interesting, but if you follow the money, you can find lots of things which are more disturbing. You could end up with ethical choices. We had a piece a couple of weeks ago which pointed out that most of the solar panels in the world are being, at least partly, one of the main material for it, polysilicon. Half of that comes from Xinjiang, the Uyghur province in China, which therefore poses a dilemma for sort of ethical consumers about whether you want to buy solar panels at the moment. So not, sometimes you follow the money, it doesn't always take you into agreeable territories. And I'm sure there are lots of people listening on this call who start shouting at the screen, saying all the other areas where companies have been letting the world down. But I think on those particular issues, I think on greenery, companies are beginning to change, and people are being held to new account, I think, and that makes a difference. Interested the other day, we ran a story about BP sold up, at the time, most people thought very virtuously, its sort of dirtier facilities up or gas facilities up in Alaska. And now what's happened is that people who are perhaps less good at thinking about the environment have taken them over. What was interesting is a number of people looked at that and thought, well, is that BP's fault? Perhaps, from my perspective, not entirely fairly. They were trying to get rid of the asset because they were trying to become greener. But people are, the point about that is that people are beginning to question in ever more complicated ways about what actually works and what doesn't. So I think within greenery, within most aspects of equality, there is a move, and it's generally in the right direction.
It's very interesting because it's all about people being more informed. Again, you sort of fear that, particularly with social media, there's a simplification and there's a sort of binary choices and so on. But the idea that people are actually making more, nuanced and informed choices, or sort of understanding better, just because the information is better, is a good sort of faith, as we would hope in, readers.
It should be said, despite that, you look around the world at the moment, there is a complete division between the world of markets and money, which at the moment, standing the collapse in various Bitcoin things over the past couple of days, is generally very optimistic. When you talk to investors, they talk about the huge wall of money that is coming in, about central banks cutting interest rates, about the amount of money Joe Biden is going to spend and other governments, including our government. You talk to the political classes and you find a completely different world where people are deeply worried about the fraction between America and China, and where you find a lot of people fearing social unrest because so many people have been left behind by this world. So I am an optimist about what's happening in our particular industry. I am also much more worried about many of the things to do with the inequality that has gone through society. But at least part of our job is to try and report that.
That's really interesting. And the question talking about sort of inequalities, and returning to the subject of journalism, could John say something about the prospects for local journalism in developing countries in the face of the large platforms and the global news organizations?
I think that there is still an immense value in local news. It's the first thing people want to know. Tragically, I've followed the Leicester Mercury around the world, and these things still make a difference. What I was pointing out before is that in general that has been the part of the market where advertising people have been least successful at building subscription models. But again, you're finding small examples of people beginning to try and do things and make people pay. I think the other bit, which is quite interesting and quite a lot of local stuff, is the value of I suppose, automation in some things. The ability now to be able to deliver things like weather, even kind of local school sports results and things like this, just simply by using computer power, where previously you had to send people out to get things, makes a difference. But people want to know what is happening. People want to know two things. They want to know about the broader world and the bigger trends out there, and that's what we obviously do a lot of. But local is enormously important, and so I still think there's a value there, but it's one where people have to change the models and try and find a way of making people, I think, in the end pay it. In the end, the old sort of parish newsletter element about it is valuable. Some people, sometimes when I talk about Bloomberg, I say that we are the parish newsletter for the financial community, and that's part of what we do, is we tell people in finance about what other people in finance are doing. Well, there are sort of, obviously in that case, we're based in a community of well-off people. As the question is pointing out, it's harder in local ones. So I think that the person is right to raise the issue, and it is the flaw, which I think I did admit at the beginning, that it is the obvious gap in the market. And what's happened in some places is that people have tried to answer it with philanthropy, that there are attempts, certainly a lot in America, to set up local journalism, to set up places to give public money to make it work. Because at the moment, if I look at American democracy, to use the Washington Post line about democracy dying in darkness, there is absolutely no evidence of democracy dying in darkness in Washington whatsoever. There's probably more journalists than ever before chasing different things that different parts of the Biden administration are doing. The place where democracy is worse is in things like state legislatures. I used to work in California in the 1990s. Back then, whenever I went to Sacramento, there was a vast Los Angeles Times bureau, there was a Sacramento Bee, there were all these other local organizations with representatives there. Now there are far fewer. And that's the zone where, do I think the media are holding local officials to account? Possibly not as much. So your questioner is exactly right. And my answer is it's a mixture between some degree of kind of, there may be room for public support, for philanthropy and things like that to try and engender it. But then secondly, in the end, I think there has to be some version of getting people to pay for it.
In a way, maybe it's a role for Facebook, that says it sort of believes in the community, that could be perhaps a bit of subsidy. Last, give up some of its money. Well, thank you.
It was meant to be the local party, so we can push it back towards him.
Very good. Well, exactly. Well, thank you very much indeed for your time and absolutely fascinating insights. And I feel much more cheerful at the end of this hour than before. So, thank you for that and for your sort of insights, post your book too, on how things might have changed. So best of luck. I can't see anyone else coming to your office. I think it's still you, but it'll be, that'll be the next thing, won't it? When do you expect offices to be full? Oh, look, 2 other people.
I think return to office, last week we were roughly about a third of people here. We have discovered 2 things, as I said at the beginning. One is the ability to be able to do work. We were astounded by how well, or I was astounded by how well we were able to cover the things we did from home. I think we've learned vast amounts about that, and we'll continue to be quite flexible in that thing. On the other hand, there's no doubt that being back in the office at least a few days a week does make a difference. You can, yesterday I sat there and went through, another of your ex-colleagues, Stephanie Flanders, and I just ran into each other and ran through a variety of things. You don't get those on Zoom calls. It tends to be much more organized. So it's a serendipity for having people together, especially managers. And I think that's true of other places. Geordie Gregg from the Daily Mail, he has the same thing. It's worth something. Now, cleverly, my lights have gone out because they would never have wondered. No, we are.
Well, on that note, the lights going out across Bloomberg. Thank you very much indeed, John, for your time. Thank you.